Hi everybody, and welcome back to Nick Talks. This episode's amazing guest is David Stark. Not David Starkey, but David Stark, so I don't want you getting confused. Um, he is an author, he's a former architect, now retired, and he's written a book about climate change, and it's called Climate Change for Young People, Antidote to Eco-Anxiety. And I feel it's a book we need because some of our young people have not only fallen for this, which is their right to do, but are actually ruining their lives and actually suffering from mental health conditions because we've scared them so much. So a book like this is definitely needed. So welcome, David, to the podcast.
Hello, Nick.
Hey, could you give us a couple of minutes of your background about how you got involved with climate change, your background, just so we know that you're just not some random guy who decided one day I'm going to Google something and write a book?
Sure. Well, in a way, I'm a random guy who's been alarmed about what's been happening. As you say, I'm a retired architect. In the early 2000s, we designed a headquarters for Scottish Natural Heritage in Inverness. And it had to be state of the art, environmentally friendly. And it was. We produced a building that was the most environmentally friendly office building in the UK at that time. But it didn't use wind or solar. That just couldn't meet the business case. Wind was too intermittent and there's not a lot of sunshine in Inverness. So we didn't do that. Later, we tried to use biofuels in a major hospital development. But when you calculated the number of lorries bringing vegetable matter to the hospital, there was a huge amount of emissions involved. And in fact, there was more emissions than using gas. So I retired and I started to read books on a more general level about climate change. I went to meetup groups and found young people who were petrified that the world was going to end. And I felt I had to do something about it. So I spent about 7 years writing everything I could, scary climate books, skeptic climate books. And I've put together this book, which has taken me some time to publish because traditional publishers are not very keen on something that contradicts the standard narrative. So I've ended up self-publishing, although I've got a very good company that has produced it for me. And the book is available on Amazon just now. The formal publication date is the 28th of this month, so bookshops may or may not have it, but it's certainly available on Amazon either as a paperback or an ebook.
Well, what I'll do is I'll put the links to your book in the description of this video. So if anybody's interested, go to the description, click the link, it'll take you straight through and you can buy David's book. So going back to young people, some of them are absolutely terrified. We see it on TV, 14-year-old girls saying, I'm never going to get married and have children because what's the point? I don't want to see my children die in a desert. I don't want them to drown. I don't want to burn up. And it's like, who's teaching them this sort of lunacy? So we're going to get more into that. So I think let's start off by trying to understand the difference between climate and the weather, because people use both of them interchangeably as if they're exactly the same thing, and they're not the same thing. Even I know that, but I couldn't tell you the difference. I just know they're not the same.
Climate is weather trends over a long period of time. The alarmists just now are prone to quote individual weather events and say the weather outside's terrible, therefore it must be because of climate change. Which is not right. We need to look at least 30 years for a trend happening. And if you look back on, say, the time of the late Queen's life, the first 20 or 30 years of that, her reign rather, the first 20 or 30 years of that, there was global cooling. And sometimes some scientists were saying we were going back to the Little Ice Age, which ended about 1820. Then we had global warming from about 1975 to the end of the century. And then there was a period of about 15 years of what the UN called a hiatus when the global warming stopped. Now, that's very difficult to work out a trend. We can look back to 1820 and compare that to today, and we know that the temperature, according to the UN, has increased by 1.09 degrees on average. That doesn't seem too bad. And they can't explain these variations in the climate, which must be caused by natural factors. They call them anomalies, which just means we don't understand it.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So let's get this straight. Climate change is real.
The climate changes.
And that, for me, that's the history of the Earth, because the climate has changed, constantly changing. And that's why, for an example, that's why we have polar bears, because polar bears were brown bears and the climate changed and they had to adapt to their new setting. We've had civilizations rise and fall due to climate change. We've had invasions across Europe because peoples have come in thousands of years ago because where they were, the climate changed. So the climate is changing all the time. So when people say the climate, not meaning you personally, but when people use the word climate denier, I don't think hardly anyone's a climate denier because we know it's changing. There's two questions there. The first question is it changing more now because of man's influence? Or are we just in natural cycles that we just don't understand?
The simple answer is both. The Charney range, which is the classic study of this, puts the anthropogenic element of doubling carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as a warming of somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees centigrade. I happen to think from what I've read that it's at the bottom end of that, or perhaps even slightly less. It might just be about one degree centigrade. But there are natural cycles, as you say. You talk about the polar bears, and we're supposed to believe that the polar bears are all dying out. But in the 30-year melting phase of Arctic ice that has finished about 10 years ago, polar bear numbers rose from about 5,000 to 30,000. The reason being we stopped shooting them in 1973. So, you know, there are certain things that where white is black and black is white that the alarmists tell us about. We can also look at studies that the UN ignores, like shellfish remains in sediments in the Arctic, which show that we came out of the last major ice age 12,000 years ago. The Holocene maximum was 9,000 years ago, so that was the warmest. It was 4 degrees warmer in the Arctic 9,000 years ago than it is today. And in between then, the climate has gone up and down. We've had warm periods, like the Iron Age warm period, the Roman warm period, the medieval warm period, and we've had cold periods, the coldest of which was the Little Ice Age, which is the coldest time in the last 10,000 years.
Yeah, and just look at some of our recent history. It wasn't that long. It was only over 100 years ago. Every Christmas, people in London used to ice skate on the Thames because it was frozen over. I remember in the 1970s being told by Blue Peter that there's a mini ice age coming, and the only way to stop it is to send in our milk tops, our tinfoil milk tops, and that's what we did. And the ice age didn't come, so I take some credit for that. I think me sending my milk bottle tops, whatever that did, it saved the mini ice age from coming. And almost every prediction we've had about the climate has just not come to pass. I'm not saying they were wrong, and I'm not saying there's a hidden agenda behind any of this. What I'm saying is it's so complicated that we still don't understand how the planet works. So, we were told the ice caps are going to melt and disappear, and the glaciers in Switzerland are going to disappear. None of that's happened. We were told about the Mauritius Islands are all going to disappear. They're actually growing. We were told the Great Barrier Reef was disappearing. It's the strongest it's ever been now. And things go up and things go down. These are natural cycles we don't understand. That's not to say we don't try to reduce the impact man's having on the earth, because we've damaged lots of things as mankind. So we need to reduce that. But it's the end of days scenario and agenda that I really, really disagree with.
You know, we are improving the environment as we get richer and can afford to do it. The best way to improve the environment is to get those people who are in poverty out of poverty, because they're the ones who are cutting down trees and burning it for firewood instead of using natural gas or some more clean, as they use the word, clean form of energy.
Yeah, I mean, I just look over my lifetime. Obviously the northwest of England where I live, it's nicer now than it's ever been. There's less litter, there's less pollution in the rivers. I remember as a kid being told, "Don't swim in rivers, don't swim in the canals because the poison." You know, the River Mersey was poisoned. We have fish in there now. People are fishing in it. That wasn't done 30, 40 years ago. And you're right, what happens is when we raise people out of poverty, because when you're living in poverty and you're struggling, you haven't got time to care about the environment. You care about your immediate family trying to put food on the table and trying to keep you warm so you don't die. But when we raise them out of poverty, and they don't have to worry about that, then they want leisure activities. They want to live in a nicer place, and they spend their time improving where they live, encouraging nature, planting trees, because that's what people want to do. They want a better quality of life.
Yeah. When I was a young person, and I mentioned this in the book, I was probably about 5 or 6. There's a hill just south of Glasgow where you get a lovely panoramic view over the whole city. But the only time you could take me there to see the city was at the end of the summer trades holidays, because the factories had been closed for 2 weeks. The rest of the year, it was covered in smog.
Yep, yep. I mean, people forget in the 50s, smog was killing thousands of people every year. That's why they introduced the Clean Air Act. So the factories burning unclean coal, burning anything we wanted to, having bonfires in your garden whenever you wanted to burn, garden rubbish. All that had to be stopped because we're polluting our own cities, our own air that we're breathing in. So we will do it. We will clean up our planet and our environment, but not if it's at the expense of us going hungry and going cold. Now, going hungry, going cold. So let's forget the hungry bit. Let's talk about cold. We're told all the time that if we don't do something, I mean, it went from climate warming to climate change to now climate emergency. And we're being told if we don't do something, millions and millions are going to die. And what I read in your book was, obviously we can't see into the future, but we know it's unlikely. But at the moment now, weather-related deaths are the lowest they've ever been. And we shouldn't be afraid of overheating. What kills us is being over cold.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to the discussion about the difference between weather and climate, last year, 1,200 people in Pakistan died because of an extreme weather event, a storm and flooding. The equivalent in 1970, 250,000 people died in a single storm. The difference is that Pakistanis are now $1,500 a year better off than they were in 1970. If we can raise them out of the relative poverty that they're in, it will be down to dozens or a handful. That's what we need to focus on. And by taking away affordable energy and using intermittent sources of energy, which cost more, despite what the propagandists say, we're not going to get people out of poverty.
Have you seen a documentary called Planet of the Humans?
Yes.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it highlights some of the hypocrisy of this whole agenda. And the bit that jumps out of my mind was, as a electric car company announces this new car, the press are all around it, it's being charged, and a reporter says to the woman doing all the presenting, senior management, so it's zero emissions. Yes, it's zero emissions. It's amazing. It can go for 100 miles, blah, 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 blah. Right. How does it get its energy? Oh, look, we were charging it now. It's being charged on a national grid. Right. In this state, do you know where most of that energy comes from National Grid? Oh, yeah, I think it's oil, gas. And it's like, so it's not zero emissions because you're using the fuel that's had that gives off emissions, you're just claiming something that's not true. It's a bit like it's a magic trick. It's a con. Look at the shiny thing. Look at the shiny thing. While this hand does something else to make it look like magic.
Well, the chap Moore who produced the documentary, he's very much left wing in America.
Michael Moore. Yeah.
Michael Moore, that's a boy, and he basically rubbished renewables, that they just don't work, because they rely on fossil fuels to back them up. But his conclusion was that it was a right-wing conspiracy of all the people that are making a fortune, which comes back to what you said earlier on. There's a left-wing push, but there's a right-wing capitalization of high energy costs.
Yeah. So let's get into that. So I didn't think of this that clearly until I read a part of your book, which was I fully understand that one of the bigger pushes of this is the far left. And the far left are lunatics and they're pushing all sorts of things, trans identity, all sorts of things that I just think are complete lunacy. But they're also pushing this. And I sort of understand it because the more far left you are, the more you're a communist, Marxist, that sort of thing where let's all live together in communes and raise each other's children. This is the way we should be until white, straight men got involved in the world and ruined it all. That hence why Oxford now are looking at 15-minute cities where if you drive outside of your area, you're going to get fined. All these are communist ideas of a time that never existed, which the far left think is some sort of utopia. That I sort of understand. I don't understand it, but I understand where they're coming from on that. And I've always treated this green lunacy from that perspective. But then reading your book, you brought something new into it, which I thought was really, really clever, which was the people running the huge organizations, these capitalist organizations are not communists. They're doing it because it makes money. And if you can make money somewhere, people will take advantage of that. So the people, who are making the solar dishes and making this and making the cars, they know none of this really works and isn't cutting emissions, but that's not their problem. If their bottom line is looking really good because they're involved with this and they're getting huge government grants and subsidies to run it, would they, in a certain way, they would be foolish not to take advantage of the situation in front of them?
Yeah. Okay, let me take both sides of it. There's a left-wing side, which is full of rich, white, privileged people who really don't have much to crap about in modern society because actually it's pretty good. But they must have a cause. They must find something wrong. Therefore, they have found a new religion, basically, which is climate change. Now, you can call them loony, but we're all subject to jumping on a bandwagon. So let's not call them loonies because they're very clever people, and they honestly believe the propaganda that they're pushing out to everyone. Then take the right wing. Now, this week at Davos, we've got 2,500 rich people who have left their seaside homes, so they're not worried about sea level rise. They've flown in their private jets, so they're not worried about emissions. But they also want to change the world. They think they're psychologically better than the rest of us, and they need a cause to make the world a better place for us all. I forget who it was in a quote in my book who said that people don't get up, people who want to save the world don't get up in the morning wanting to do bad things. They want to do good things, but end up doing bad things. So you can't criticize people's motivations. They just get very mixed up in it. The oil companies a long time ago gave up opposing the green agenda because they knew they couldn't win. So if you can't beat them, join them. So BP now, instead of paying tax in the UK on the massive profits they make, they invest it in offshore wind, knowing that offshore wind will keep prices high and the long-term profits will keep rolling in.
Wow. It's wow. That's deep. That's a lot of thinking if that's what you're going to do with your profits to keep your basic product as high as possible to make money. But they're sort of
Why wouldn't you, if you were running a business, would you not want a monopoly that allows you to push prices up?
oh, absolutely, yeah.
It's just business practice.
Yeah, and it's human nature. Human nature is, and that's why we've been a successful creature. Human nature is to try to get the most out of everything we do. Um, and we will bend the rules. We will. Some people will break the rules. That's why we have criminality in all countries, because some people will go too far. This reminds me a little bit of the new Labour government when Tony Blair said to all the hospitals, "You've got to get everybody from A&E who needs a bed. They've got to be in a bed in so many hours, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it is." And all of a sudden, over the year, all the hospitals were meeting the target. And some investigative journalists went into hospitals to find out how are they managing this, and if they can manage it, why weren't they doing it for decades? And it turns out all doctors were doing was when they knew someone needed a bed, they would put them in a hallway, sit them on the bed. That was classed as now you have a bed. Well, that's not what was meant by the directive from New Labour government, but we find ways around things to be successful, and that's exactly what these companies are doing now.
Yes. There's a simple way to think about why we've got an energy crisis and a cost of living crisis just now. We've got two systems of energy generation, one that works when the wind blows and another one that steps in when it doesn't. The one that steps in when it doesn't is essential, but the one that does when the wind blows is an add-on. So we're paying twice for energy, and that's why energy doubled in price. We need gas for the reliable system, and instead of obtaining it from democratic countries like the UK, Germany, Netherlands, Poland, Ukraine, which have shale gas reserves, the green people persuaded us to buy it from Russia. Now that failed, and the energy costs doubled again. So it's now 4 times what it should be, except the people in the Green Party say, well, no, we must build more windmills because that's the problem. Well, it's not. That's causing the problem in the first place.
If we drill all the way down to the bottom of this, I think the real problem for us are career politicians in the UK. We have no leaders anymore now who say this is my vision for the future, and I'm going to make unpopular decisions today, and no one will get benefit of those decisions until 2 decades from now. But I don't care because I'm doing it for the future of the country. We have politicians now who create policy based on opinion polls. Oh, people seem to like this, I'll do some of that. How we handed over our energy security, and let's not beat around the bush, this is security. If you want to kill a country and you can control its energy, all you've got to do is cut off its energy to that country, just like you could cut off food from a country and you will kill that country. We're too heavily relying on Russia, and we're too heavily relying on the Middle East. These are 2 unstable areas run by dictators and people we really shouldn't be dealing with that much. And we shouldn't be giving them our security to put in their hands to tighten whenever they want. But we've allowed this to happen. And let's go back to what you said before. It's when you said a lot of this has been promoted by rich, comfortable people in this country, because we've forgotten that progress isn't a one-way street. Progress can actually collapse, and then you start going backwards, and that's what we're at risk of doing now. And we think these good times are going to last forever. They're not going to last forever because we make too many mistakes, we'll go backwards. And I go right back to what I said a minute ago. It's our politicians. But again, when you go back to politicians, we need to take a responsibility for that because we keep voting them in. So we're partly responsible for not getting the politicians we needed to save the country and keep our energy security alive and in our hands.
Ed Miliband is a career politician. He hasn't done a decent day's work in his life, if you believe that politics is not a decent day's work. He moved from London up to the north of England to get a Labour seat. Labour sent him to America, where he met John Kerry, who persuaded him that green causes were the way to go. So, as an instant expert on climate change and energy policy, he proposed the Climate Change Act and net zero. And he's now back with Labour proposing a green agenda. But they have no clue as to what the real issues are. That they're just doing a noble cause as far as they're concerned.
If you want to be a bit more sinister, you could. I saw an interview with the old politician, former politician Tony Benn from the 70s, and he said some very clever stuff over his time. In this interview, he said, "If you want to control a population, keep them afraid and make them stupid." And I think that's definitely happening in our country. Our education system's failing, and the government is keeping us afraid all the time because that's how they can control us. My final question is one that I can't believe I have to ask, and I did O-level chemistry, so I'm not that clever. And for people who don't know what an O-level is, it's an old GCSE. So the question is carbon dioxide a poison?
Yeah. I used to love organic chemistry at school, hydrocarbon chains, all that sort of stuff. It was a very positive message. Now I think they're being taught at school that carbon is the devil's element. Carbon dioxide, instead of being plant food, is a pollutant. At the beginning of the Carboniferous period, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was at 5,000 parts per million, which is why there were vast rainforests on the planet and coal deposits were laid down. At the beginning of the Cretaceous period, it was over 3,000 parts per million, which produced so much vegetation that dinosaurs could grow to a huge size. Shellfish numbers multiplied because there was lots of carbon dioxide for them to build their carbon shells, carbon calcite shells, which is left of the chalk deposits we've got just now. In the last 50 years, the amount of vegetation on the planet has increased by about 10% because we've increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. Do I need to say any more?
So if it went from 5 million parts to, did you say 3 million parts? No, per million, what is it now?
We've raised it from about 300 to 420 parts per million.
And in the past, it was up to 3,000 and 5,000 parts per million.
Yes. And that's because there was a lot more volcanic activity in those days, and volcanoes throw out carbon dioxide.
Yeah. So carbon dioxide to me is a gas in the air. Plants take in that gas, they keep the carbon because that makes them grow, and they expel the oxygen. Animals, like us, breathe in the oxygen, and then we breathe out carbon dioxide. So there is a symbiotic relationship between animals and plants there. What people also don't know is in the commercial food growing areas, and you've got these huge greenhouses, these farmers pump in carbon dioxide into the greenhouses because it gives a bigger yield to the plants. So I don't understand why all of a sudden carbon dioxide is the bad guy, and now we're trying to reduce what is keeping our planet green and helping plants grow.
Yes, it's even better than that. In arid areas, the greening is even more happening. When a plant opens its pores to take in carbon dioxide, it also releases some water vapor. So the less it has to open its pores, because there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the less water vapor it releases, therefore the less water it needs to take in. So in arid areas, more carbon dioxide is a really good idea.
And again, a simplistic phrase like let's reduce carbon dioxide, most people don't understand the natural cycles of the planet, but also natural cycles in the world of plants and animals and how these things all have a knock-on effect to each other. It's like pulling a card out of a house of cards thinking we don't need this one, but you've got no idea what that's holding up and what's that related to. And unintended consequences, we do this all the time. And the best example is when we go into the Middle East to remove a dictator. Dictators bad. Well, dictators are bad, so we remove them, and then look what happens to Libya. Look what happens to Iraq, and we think, oh, it might be better if we'd not done anything there because we didn't understand the complex mechanism of a system that we have no idea how it works. And I think this green agenda comes under that. We're having so many unintended consequences when we mess with complex systems. This has been a fantastic conversation, David. Thank you very much. Is there anything else you want to say that I've not asked you that you wanted, that you're dying to mention?
Just a small thing that was brought to mind when you were talking there. We know that carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas gets saturated at the various wavelengths that it reacts to, and that most of the power of carbon dioxide is in the first 100 parts per million. So people tend to think if we double carbon dioxide, we'll double the warming power. That's not the case. We know that some wavelengths, it's already saturated and will have no effect, which is why we just don't know how much warming effect it will have, but it's nothing like what the alarmists tell us. So more carbon dioxide has lots of positive things like increasing plant life. It probably doesn't have anything like the alarming causes for warming that we're told.
No, yep, completely agree. And let's go back to what we said at the beginning. We know so little about our planet and the cycles, the phases, how it all works. We think we do. We think we're the cleverest beings in the universe. We're still infants. We're still trying to understand lots and lots of things. It wasn't that long ago. If you go back 20, 30 years, the scientists who were the brightest in the country 30 years ago, we now know we're wrong in most things they thought or believed to be true because we've learned even more. And 30 years from now, we'll look back and go, I can't believe people were believing half of this stuff.
But when somebody says the science is settled, they're charlatans.
Yeah, there's no such thing as settled science. Science is always developing and always changing. Thank you, David. That was a great chat, and hopefully I'll speak to you again soon. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Nick.